Part 1. The Voice from the Other Side. Stephen King once answered the question of why he was so successful as an author, but the question wasn't posed by an interviewer, it was actually posed by one of the characters in his books, specifically in the 7th and final book of his Dark Tower series. Now, no spoilers here, but in a very meta, in-world way, one of the characters basically asks, how did this Stephen King guy get so famous? And Roland, the main character of the series, answers by saying this: he hears the right voices and sings the right songs. Now, this is an in-world answer that conforms to the rules of the Dark Tower universe, but it also applies in our world. Stephen King himself even once described writing as a kind of self-hypnosis. And this idea that creativity comes from some proverbial other side is not unique to Stephen King. Other creatives of all different disciplines describe the creative process in a similar way. For example, the producer and more recently creativity guru, Rick Rubin, uses the word source to describe the place where creative ideas come from. According to Rubin, source is everything. It's how everything exists. It's a pure energy of productivity in the literal sense of the word, like it produces everything. And the creative process, he says, is a matter of tapping into that source.
Our part of it is the antenna that connects to it. Mm-hmm. And maybe we're the vehicle for source to allow things to happen in the world.
So these points are to say that the creative process is one of channeling. It's letting something from outside of yourself in and letting it pass through you. It's heeding the words of the voices and singing their songs. In this video, I want to explore that specific aspect of the creative process, the channeling, and I want to use that to help answer this question. Why are creative people often so self-destructive? Now, I'm going to specifically focus on music here, but of course, this applies to other artists and creative disciplines as well. I mean, speaking of Stephen King, he was an alcoholic in the early part of his career. But if you think of it, our associations with creative people, especially in music, with musical artists, you think of them as brooding and manic, and you think of drug use and drinking and these enigmatic personas and erratic public behavior, and I mean, the amount of mugshots that you can find of rock stars. And some of the artists who we herald most highly are the same ones who tragically met an early end. The 27 Club epitomizes that idea. The fact that there's a phenomenon of an early grave, widespread enough to include some of rock and roll's most renowned artists, says everything about the connection between creative people and self-destruction. So in examining why creative people are so prone to self-destruction, I think we also need to examine the role that creativity itself has to play. Is there something about the creative process that lends to this trend? Is the creative process, if not done properly, actually dangerous? Let's dig in. So, I want to look at an example, which no better place to start than with one of the more prominent members of the 27 Club, Mr. Mojo Rison himself. So I chose Jim Morrison as our paradigm for this because in addition to his very public descent into self-destruction, he also demonstrates the idea of channeling in a creative sense in a very clear way. In fact, one of Jim's earliest memories was of a sort of channeling experience, or maybe you could call it possession. I'm referring to a moment from Jim's childhood that he describes in this lyric from the song Peace Frog, which Doors fans will undoubtedly say along with him.
Indians scattered on Dawn's highway bleeding. Ghosts crowd the young child's fragile eggshell mind.
The number of people who just went
blood in the streets in the town of New Haven
is more than zero. So as I said, this lyric is not just a line of poetry, it's a true biographical moment from Jim's life, and clearly one that had a deep effect on his young, impressionable psyche. So Jim actually describes the story in full in a track titled Dawn's Highway, which was posthumously released by the Doors on an album called An American Prayer.
Me and my mother and father and a grandmother and a grandfather were driving through the desert at dawn, and a truckload of Indian workers had either hit another car or just, I don't know what happened, but there were Indians scattered all over the highway, bleeding to death. So the car pulls up and stops. That was the first time I tasted fear. I must have been about 4. The reaction I get now, thinking about it looking back, is that the souls or the ghosts of those dead Indians, maybe one or two of them, were just running around, freaking out, and just leaped into my soul. And they're still there.
First of all, chilling. Second, I find this point interesting as an example of channeling. One of Jim's earliest memories is of letting some other force in, whether he chose it or not. When those spirits leapt into his soul, as he said, he knew what it was like to commune with a force outside of himself. And this is similar to how Jim describes the creative process for himself, in the same terms that Rick Rubin and Stephen King use. So in a 1969 interview for Rolling Stone magazine with Jerry Hopkins, great interview, Jim touched on his creative process. Specifically, he detailed what he considered to be one of the most creatively productive days of his life. It was a day on the beach in California, back when he had just graduated as a film student from UCLA, in which, in one sitting, he said he wrote just a bunch of songs in his notebook. And here is how he described it. It was a beautiful hot summer, and I just started hearing songs. I think I still have the notebook with those songs written in it. This kind of mythic concert that I heard. I'd like to try and reproduce it sometime, either in actuality or on record. Notice how Jim attributes none of the creativity to himself. He just started hearing songs. They came to him unbidden, kind of like they came from the source that Rubin might say, or the voices spoke to Jim, as Stephen King might say. Side note, the Doors never reproduced the songs from Jim's notebook. I thought at first maybe he was referring to Celebration of the Lizard, but that song is a smattering of disconnected pieces. It was written later, so alas. So we've seen the way that an artist uses channeling or source as a key part of the creative process, letting something else in, letting something else kind of move through you. Now let's examine the dark side of that process. In the mind of any Doors fan, memories of Jim Morrison's poetry and his uniquely rambunctious performance style rest right alongside his infamous incidents of uncontrolled drunken behavior. The guy liked to drink. A lot of rock stars at the time did. But Jim was known for getting drunk enough on stage that he would curse at the audience or shout incoherently into the microphone saying things like this.
Fuck your baby in the asshole.
And that clip is him performing with Jimi Hendrix. That is a man with no shame. Obviously, it's not necessarily unique at the time for a rock and roll star to be drunk on stage. But Jim Morrison was not some brash rock and roll playboy. He was the soft-hearted poet. The Doors keyboardist Ray Manzarek, also Jim's good friend, said that there were two different Jims. There was sober Jim, who was his good friend, a kind and caring person, and then there was drinking Jim. And Ray said that drinking Jim was so different from Jim Morrison as he knew him that it was essentially an alter ego. Ray had said this in multiple interviews, including this one that appeared in the Irish Times, in which he said, quote, "It was Jimbo, the alter ego of Jim Morrison, that dark Irish drunk who took himself to Paris, and Jimbo that killed my friend Jim Morrison. And I hate that Jimbo." Shots fired at the Irish, but beside the point. According to Ray, Jimbo was the drunken rabble-rouser with the glazed eyes that you can see in old clips. Jim was the handsome rock and roll poet. And Ray also often criticized Oliver Stone's film The Doors for his portrayal of Jim Morrison in it, saying about the film, "It was not about Jim Morrison, it was about Jimbo Morrison, the drunk." God, where was the sensitive poet and the funny guy? Of course, there was undoubtedly overlap between Jim and Jimbo. Whether drunk or sober, for example, Jim seemed to love provoking his audience. But the difference between the two personas was stark enough for Ray, one of Jim's closest friends, to note that Jimbo was basically a different person from Jim. So here's where things start to connect. I remember when I first heard Ray describe Jimbo, and the first thing I thought of was Dawn's Highway, because both are instances of Jim letting some outside force take over. And stick with me here, I wondered whether alcohol somehow loosened the metaphysical barrier between Jim's soul and those of the dead spirits who leapt into him that day, and whether Jimbo was the battlefield on which the spirits and Jim's own soul fought for ownership of his body. Of course, that's all poeticism and metaphor, but the concept is the important part. Jim was prone, it's clear, to essentially becoming a different person, whether creatively or on stage or through his alcohol use. Even in how he describes the scene in Dawn's Highway, him saying that in retrospect it felt as though spirits leapt into his soul. You almost get the sense that he's wondering if that explains his habit for letting some other force take over, as though he knows there are times where something else takes charge and he's trying to make sense of it. Well, if there is a single instance in which Jim let the other side take complete control, it was the Doors concert in Miami in 1969. This event lives down in infamy in Doors history. It's also the climax of Oliver Stone's Doors movie. At that show, it was definitely Jimbo on stage. Audibly so. I mean, if you listen to recordings of that night, Jim, his singing is... The trouble began when Jim invited the audience up on stage.
Come on down here, come on. Get closer, man.
And the trouble continued when the police stepped in to stop him. Then, the most highly contested moment in the life of Jim Morrison next to his death. Ray Manzarek said he didn't do it, but it is a known fact that Jim asked the crowd if they wanted to see what he was working with. And many in the crowd said that he showed them what he was working with. So Jim was arrested for public indecency. Again, this is the man who wrote Love Street. This is the poet and funny guy. And from here, it only got worse. I mean, within 2 years of this event, Jim Morrison was dead. There are many factors that we can point to in the downfall of Jim Morrison and in other rockers like him. His drinking habit, his drug use, his love for provoking the public and pushing the envelope. Even his childhood upbringing could play a role. All these are variables that we should consider. But I'd also point out the role of creativity. Jim was a shining example of the creative process at work. I mean, the man was a living exemplar of letting the spirit move him, being a vessel for a force from the other side to speak and act in our world. That's perhaps why he's the source of some of the most memorable songs and lyrics in rock, but it may also be part of the answer for why he isn't around today. Here's where we bring it all together. The creative process requires openness to something else taking over. It requires that the artist trusts the spirit that knocks at the door. Requires the habit of answering the door, of letting the spirit in. This means that creative people, naturally, are highly suggestible. They're rewarded for being a terminal, a pass-through for the muses of the other side. That comes with its blessings and curses. Because every artist knows the feeling of letting that mysterious force take a hold, letting it flow, and letting it, through them, do something that surprises their audience. Or do something that surprises even themselves. It's the mysterious magic of the creative process, the channeling of source, the becoming another person, the flow state. Another way of saying it is the process of creativity is one of saying yes to impulse. It's chicken and egg in terms of causation, of course. Like, are creative people creative because they're impulsive, or are they impulsive because they're creative? I'm sure it's case by case. This is all just to point out the connection between the two. Neil Young gets at this exact idea with one of the most famous rock lyrics in history from My Hey Hey, which is, "It's better to burn out than it is to rust." If you really think about this, it's hard to reckon with. Neil Young has been asked about the meaning of this line in interviews, and he's had this to say about it.
They went at their peak, and that's the way everybody remembers them. And that's what rock and roll is all about, that edge, the peak, the thing. So you look at that and you go, well, maybe it is better to just burn out than it is to fade away for rock and roll. And this song's about rock and roll. It's not about life. Life has children, it has family, it has relationships, it has nature, it has beauty, it has all of these other things that rock and roll is part of, but rock and roll is its own thing, and it's an animal all to itself. But for rock and roll, if that's all you are, and that's all you want to do, exploding is not bad.
That is basically to say, in pure terms of rock and roll legendarium, the best way to achieve high stature is to go out in a blaze of glory. I dare say that's what the unfiltered creative spirit pushes for, not out of any malice. I think it's just the nature of the creative spirit. It's less so the case that there are good voices and bad voices from that other side. I think the voices of the muses, the voices of that other side are good. They're as Rick Rubin describes source. It's a pure, authentic, organic, productive energy. The wisdom that creativity demands is understanding when the muse is speaking and when something else is speaking. Because the voices of the other side have the pure intention of creating the work, of speaking through the vessel, and that's the end of it. It is the artist who gets caught up on everything else that goes with it. Fame, money, a reaction, whatever it is. The muse and the voice has nothing to do with that. So the cost of creativity, the danger of it, is that saying yes to the muse that knocks at your door can look similar to the untrained creative to saying yes to an impulse. So in the case of Jim Morrison, you can look at his performance style, his lyricism, all of this, and see that clearly the artistic muse that was speaking through him was one that pushed him to provoke his audience, to push them outside of their comfort zones. However, his actions in Miami that night, that was no form of artistic expression. That was just pure drunk old Jimbo following an impulse. But that right there is the point. From Jim's perspective, the experience of saying yes to a drunken impulse and saying yes to the voice of the muse might feel very similar, might feel the exact same, especially when he's out there drunk on stage. So a totally open channeling of the creative spirit can be kind of like the inverse of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's like unfiltered water. It's an open channeling of source with no careful osmosis. You might let in some of the good stuff and some of the bad stuff. The life of Jim Morrison and that of many others in the 27 Club show that there are many voices on the other side that knock. It takes wisdom to know what voice is speaking to you, what voice is knocking at your door. But to have longevity in the game of creativity, it requires that you know when to open the door and when to keep it locked. Now, as a PS to this video, one big gap in the discussion is the role of drugs. We touched on alcohol as kind of a spiritual wall thinner, but the role of drug use in the creative process of rock stars at this time and in the early demise of rock stars at this time really can't be overstated. So I'm going to dedicate an entire video to that topic as we continue on discussing the cost of creativity. I truly want to hear your takes on all of this in the comments. I mean, we're going out there, so this is a place for discussion. So let's discuss. See you there, and see you in the next video.